Okay, good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening for the Low Maintenance Landscape Projects webinar for Colorado Springs Utilities. My name is Scott Winter. I'm a project manager here at Colorado Springs Utilities. I will be talking to you about low maintenance landscapes tonight. I've got a lot of experience working in the landscape, born and raised in Kansas. Close to the land, I guess you could say. I've got a bachelor's degree in horticulture from Kansas State and a master's in geography from UCCS. I spent 10 years in public horticulture working for botanical gardens in northern Arizona and in Vail, Colorado before I came to Colorado Springs Utilities. I've been here now for 16 years. I work on a variety of projects here for our demand management group and working on conservation, demand planning, and efficiency program development. Um, Also, I work with my wife in her gardening business, and so I keep my hands dirty as much as possible. So let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. We're going to talk about what a water-wise landscape is. As the water provider, we always keep all of our content related to water. And so when we're talking about low maintenance landscapes, we will be talking about what is water wise as well. So low water and low maintenance go hand in hand. We'll talk about what we mean by low maintenance. Everyone's going to have a little bit different definition for that, but we'll get kind of specific about what I mean when I talk about low maintenance. You will have to determine what that is for yourself, but we'll talk about some different ideas around that. So we'll talk about those misconceptions, as I mentioned. Then we'll move on to the keys to success. So we can clarify, no matter what kind of project you want to do, the things that will set you up for success with those projects. So we'll go through that. Then we'll talk about low maintenance plants. Very often when people think of a low maintenance landscape, they really focus on the plants. The plants are really important, obviously, but we'll talk about how those plants need to fit into the landscape to really achieve a low maintenance landscape. So we'll go there, and then I want to spend most of the time talking about low maintenance projects. So getting into a little bit more detail about a few different low maintenance options that you'll have. A couple of times along the way, about halfway through the presentation, and then again at the end, we'll answer some questions. So if you have questions now or as we go through this, please feel free to type those into the question box. So what is a water-wise landscape? I think there's some misconceptions about what water-wise landscapes are. At Colorado Springs Utilities, we really are promoting waterwise landscapes that are loaded with living plants. We want the landscape to be practical and useful, no matter what you need the landscape to do for you. We want it to be durable and adaptable. So it needs to survive the ups and downs of our weather here. We have periodic drought. We have hailstorms, we have heavy rain at times, we have late frost and early frost. So the landscapes we create need to be durable and adaptable to those changing weather patterns. Obviously, we want them to be attractive and enriching. We want them to make our lives better, not harder. I assume that's why most of you are here, to create a landscape that is not a burden for you. And we obviously want these also to be resource conserving, so we need them to be easy to manage for us, so we don't want to spend too much time or money on them. Obviously, we don't want to spend too much in terms of water on them either. So we really want to have a landscape that achieves all of these different pieces, and how it does that will differ from landscape to landscape, but these are the objectives of a water-wise landscape. And so what is low maintenance? As I mentioned before, low maintenance really needs to be defined by you. That's going to vary depending on what your needs are, what your time constraints are, what your physical constraints are, and probably what your financial constraints are as well. So it's dependent, but ultimately it comes down to having the right plants in the right places with the right inputs. So it's not just right plant, right place. It's really dependent upon those inputs. So maintenance, water, fertilization, those kinds of things. So what are you providing to the landscape, and what is the timing of those things you're providing? So are you providing the right inputs at the right time? So, and maintenance is really not about just how much you're doing. You want to think about the duration and timing of the maintenance. So, for example, do you need to be out in the yard every single week for 15 minutes? Do you need to be in the yard once a month for an hour? Do you need to spend a whole day in the yard working on it a couple of times a year? So when you're thinking about what low maintenance means to you and what kind of maintenance you're willing to invest in the landscape, you want to think about what you can provide. And so that will help determine the kinds of landscape you need to create. The frequency and intensity of the maintenance, some kinds of maintenance can be quite physically demanding. So if you've got physical limitations, or if you just don't want to have to work that hard, you need to really think about how to build a landscape that's going to be physically, maybe it takes fairly frequent maintenance, but it's not physically demanding. So think about it in those terms as well. Also, maintenance takes some skill and knowledge, and you want to understand what your limitations are with regard to your skill and your knowledge. How much are you willing to learn to maintain things properly? If you want to keep things extremely simple, you don't want to learn a whole lot more, that will certainly limit your options and dictate how you create a landscape. Almost every landscape is going to require some tools and equipment. And as we get into this, we'll talk a little bit more about what you might need in order to maintain different kinds of landscapes properly. And some of those things could cost a fair bit of money. They're going to require some maintenance. And so you certainly want to think those through when you're planning your landscape. So we'll talk specifically about the different kinds of maintenance we're going to do. Watering is a big component of that. I will say right up front that if you want low maintenance, it's very likely you're going to want an irrigation system. Now you may be thinking that you don't want to deal with an irrigation system. That's a kind of maintenance you don't want to deal with. Maybe you want a landscape that uses very little water, so an irrigation system doesn't make sense for you. I would advocate that for our environment, given the ups and downs of our weather and the periodic droughts we have, an irrigation system makes a lot of sense, especially if you feel like you're not going to be able to consistently get out and water the things you have in your yard. It is very challenging to create a landscape that doesn't need any additional water. And that requires typically a lot of specialized knowledge of plants and how to grow them without water. So if you're thinking you don't want to water at all, I could certainly work with you offline in some way to talk you through how that might work. But we won't focus on that today. I'm going to assume that you're going to be watering this fairly consistently, and if that's the case, an irrigation system makes a lot of sense. Of course, it's expensive on the front end to have a fully automated system, but if low maintenance is your objective, I would suggest that you really strongly consider having an irrigation system. Of course, it's not no maintenance to have an irrigation system. You will have to do periodic maintenance. each spring and fall, you'll have a little bit of extra time to spend with that, and you'll have to make adjustments to the irrigation schedules throughout the season. So irrigation systems are not no maintenance, but they are less maintenance than dragging a hose around. So weed control, this is one of the biggest challenges with any landscape. The key to really getting started is to get complete control of the weeds. If you're doing a whole new project, you want complete control of the weeds before you start planting new plants. I've seen people really try to do the bare minimum in terms of controlling weeds before they, and then they start planting plants and building a landscape, and it almost always ends up causing a lot of problems. So any project you're doing, you want to have complete control of those weeds in advance, or you're going to set yourself up for more maintenance and potentially, losing new plants and those kinds of things if you don't have good control of the weeds. So this is a really key component of any successful project on the front end. Get control of the weeds and make sure you have a plan for dealing with those moving forward. Doing so can create, can be very challenging physically. It may be that you need to use chemicals. If you're opposed to using chemicals for weed control, you certainly will have to probably do more physical labor to deal with the weeds. If you've got a real weedy situation. If you don't have a lot of weeds currently, congratulations, that's a good place to be. So just make sure that this is something you give a lot of attention to on the front end. In order to deal with weeds after the landscape is built, you need to be consistent. It's really challenging if you get way behind on weed control and they start going to seed and they're blooming and they're dropping seed everywhere and you're way behind. That's challenging. So low maintenance will never mean no maintenance. So you want to make sure that you stay on top of it, and that will actually reduce the amount of maintenance you're doing in the long run. If you get behind, you're going to be struggling to keep up, and it will take more work to do that. So plan to be fairly consistent in dealing with your weeds. And as I mentioned, chemicals can certainly reduce the maintenance, but if they're not desirable to you for whatever reason, you just recognize that there's a trade-off there that you're probably going to have to spend more time pulling weeds by hand. That's a trade-off I've made. I've decided, because I have young kids, that I'd rather not use very many chemicals at all, and I know that I'm going to have to spend more time pulling weeds than I'd prefer, but that's the trade-off. So pruning and shearing, this is kind of fundamental in landscape maintenance to some degree. You can certainly choose plants that need less pruning and shearing, or you can make choices where you have to do a lot of shearing for maybe one time a year just to cut everything back in the spring, but very little beyond that. That's kind of what you should expect, is to do one big cleanup maybe in the spring, but not have to do a whole lot of shearing and pruning after that. So we'll talk about how to choose plants appropriately so that you don't have to spend a lot of time pruning and shearing. It certainly requires some equipment to do that, so you want to you'll probably want to minimize that as much as possible. And we'll talk about plant selection and how to design appropriately for doing that as we get further into this. So mowing, a lot of folks are going to end up with a lawn, whether it's a Kentucky bluegrass or some cool season lawn or a native grass lawn. Mowing is a pretty typical kind of maintenance. It's hard to do mowing without a powered mower. There are instances, if you have a really small lawn or something, that you could get away with maybe an old-fashioned reel mower or an electric mower potentially as well, but that's going to require some equipment. We'll talk about the difference between cool season grasses and native grasses in terms of the frequency of mowing. Some of you maybe are really tired of mowing every week and are looking for just less frequency in terms of mowing, and native grasses could certainly help with that, or switching to a different kind of landscape altogether that does not require mowing. So we'll talk more specifics on that as well. So getting into the misconceptions about low maintenance, I think the number one misconception is that if I put in rock over fabric, that's going to solve all my problems and I won't have to ever pull weeds and I won't ever have to worry about any of that stuff again. I'll have a nice clean landscape and that will last forever. Unfortunately, that is definitely a misconception. Rocks over fabric are actually quite challenging to deal with from a maintenance perspective. Particularly these large cobbles you see in this photo can be really challenging to deal with. So if you put in rocks over fabric that are unplanted, after a couple of years, you might get a little reprieve for the first couple of years. But after a couple of years, you're going to start getting weeds growing through those rocks, and it's going to be extremely challenging to deal with without either the use of chemicals or a lot of hand weeding. So it's a challenge that we're seeing a lot in this community. I think a lot of folks have made this choice, and it might be a good short-term solution in some ways, but over time it becomes really challenging. The fabric always becomes a problem as well. It tends to start peeking up through those rocks at some point and becomes a challenge from that perspective as well. It's very difficult to remove once you put it in as well. And some of you maybe have inherited landscapes like this and are trying to figure out how to deal with it. It is quite challenging, particularly these larger rocks are really difficult to remove if you've got to do that. And really plants, if you have shrubs or grasses or those kinds of things planted in these kinds of areas, if the fabric is up close to the bottom of those plants, the plants are going to struggle. Plants do not like fabric typically. You might be able to get away with some rocks over fabric in areas where things aren't planted if you keep it small and you know that you're taking on a potential weedy burden over time. So just think that through. It's not a solution that I would advocate for. So we'll talk about some better alternatives as we get further along here. The other misconception is that low maintenance landscapes tend to have very few plants. In fact, the opposite tends to be true. Because you want to compete with weeds, one way or the other, you've got to have a lot of plants in the landscape typically to do that. There are a couple of instances where you could have a lot of organic mulch, some wood-based mulch or humus as a mulch, where you may not have to have a lot of plants in that to keep the weeds down and keep the maintenance down. But in many cases, your best bet is actually to have a lot of plants covering the ground and competing with weeds. You just need to have the right plants so that those plants are not requiring a lot of maintenance. And so I think this misconception, as we'll demonstrate, is can be disproven pretty easily. And as I mentioned before, if your idea of maintenance is what this fellow's doing here, maybe you should have bought a condo. Landscapes are definitely worthy of maintenance. It's important. There is a lot of value for your property wrapped up in the landscape. The estimate that you might see kicked around a lot is that the landscape is about 10% of the property value. And that's pretty typical, but it varies a lot, obviously. It's important to maintain it properly. Obviously, it's important to maintain your quality of life and make sure that you're spending your time doing the things you really want to do rather than pulling weeds every weekend. But don't expect it to be no maintenance. I think that's just not going to work and give you what you want and add value to your home. So it's a good time to type in questions if you have them. We'll do 3 more slides and then I'll answer some of those questions. So we'll talk just briefly about the keys to success here before we answer those questions. You certainly need to know your needs and your limitations and plan for those. So again, as I mentioned before, if your limitations are physical in nature, make sure that you're not planning a landscape that is going to create a lot more physical demand for your body in the landscape. And we'll talk about ways to do that as we get into some of the specific projects. Again, getting complete control of the weeds before you start and then being consistent with those afterward. Water only wear to the extent necessary. So a lot of times you can get much more weed problems from watering the landscape where plants aren't. So a lot of times people will put spray irrigation in, or they'll use a sprinkler to irrigate some part of their landscape where there might be just 3 or 4 shrubs and a lot of open ground, and that extra water is going to really stimulate the weeds to come in and become a problem. So you really want to try to focus your irrigation where the desirable plants are and not where they're not. You can also get more weeds if you overwater, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about native grass. So native grass is a great option, but very often we see people put in native grass and then they start watering it like it's turf grass, and it becomes a weedy mess over time because they've just overwatered it. And so you want to make sure that you're watering appropriately for the plant material you have and putting the water where it needs to be. The biggest points we want to touch on here is about being consistent and about covering the ground. So covering the ground is we're talking about with living vegetation or with organic mulch or both. Those are your best bets for keeping your maintenance at a minimum. And so because those are 2 of the real keys here, I want to just go a little deeper with those. Being consistent is, again, creating some sort of schedule almost. If it's not every week, maybe every 2 weeks, where you're really controlling weeds before they start to go to bloom and produce seed and spread around. Hopefully you don't end up with weeds that are 8 or 10 feet tall in your yard. If you've waited that long, then you're probably not being consistent. So have a plan to do a little bit consistently throughout the season, or the maintenance will actually become more over time. So that's one way to really minimize the amount of maintenance you do, is by doing it consistently. Especially during the establishment period for a new landscape, but also on an ongoing basis with an established landscape. So we'll talk about how as a landscape gets established, you can reduce that frequency, both the frequency and the duration of your time in there. But initially you're going to have to spend a little extra time, and if you can plan for that and be okay with that, then you'll have less and less maintenance over time as your landscape matures. And covering the ground, as I mentioned before, you really want to focus on covering the ground with living vegetation as much as possible, and where that's not possible, with an organic mulch. Unplanted areas, bare dirt, bare rock, those are going to be your enemies over time. You're going to end up with lots of maintenance problems. It's going to be really hard to compete with weeds if you're not planting areas and covering the ground. And if you do use rock, try to use a smaller aggregate. It's much easier to clean up. Large rock is very difficult to deal with in terms of dealing with leaves that have fallen and pine needles and those kinds of things. 3 to 4 inches of organic mulch, some sort of wood-based mulch, is very helpful for controlling weeds, particularly as you're establishing a landscape where maybe you've planted a lot of spreading shrubs that are going to cover the ground eventually, but in the meantime, that organic mulch is really what is there competing with the weeds. So those are the basic keys to success. We'll talk about projects here after we answer a few questions.
Okay, Scott, so how do you best prepare the soil for the plants?
So that's a very good question. It really depends on the plants that you're planting. We will get into those specifics as we go through a few of the slides moving forward. If you're planting native plants or native grass, it's going to be very different from where you're planting, say you're planting a vegetable bed or perennials or a cool season grass like Kentucky bluegrass. We'll get into more specifics about how to prepare soil with a couple of the projects we'll be talking about, but it really is dependent upon the plant material, and it's dependent upon your soils as well. If you've got pure sand or pure clay, even with native plants, you're going to want to amend that soil with some sort of compost, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so I'm going to roll up a few questions. Where can I get the plants? Identify plants that are good for this climate and good to look at, nice to look at. Mm-hmm. And yeah, how about those two?
Yeah, plants are the big one. I know that you know, that's where people put a lot of their attention, is on where do I get the plants. So local garden centers are going to be your best bet for plant material, as well as the expertise that goes along with that. So if you can go to a garden center locally, you'll both get the plants that have really been tried and true in our area, as well as someone to bounce your ideas off of. And so that's what I would recommend as a local garden center for the plants. Selecting the right plants, we'll talk about this as we get more toward the end of the presentation, but Colorado Springs Utilities has a website called waterwiseplants.org, and I will show you that website toward the end, but that's a great resource to help you filter through those plants, figure out what things will fit for you. It actually will allow you to filter by low maintenance as well. So if you're just looking for low maintenance shrubs, for example, you can filter and look for those on that website. So, and you can develop a favorites list that you could bring with you to a garden center so that you're prepared in advance. You could even call ahead, given the COVID-19 situation. You may want to call ahead to make sure they have those plants before you head out there. So we'll talk a little bit more about that website, but the local garden centers are always a great resource.
Okay, so there's several questions about mulch. What's best for xeriscaping, mulch or rock, or does it matter? Is pea gravel okay to use as mulch along a rock retaining wall? Yeah, there's several about different types of mulch and mulch choices.
Okay, so yeah, mulch is a really important issue to deal with, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think the important thing to keep in mind is that a wood-based mulch, something like humus, the city and Colorado Springs Utilities actually provides a free mulch. On Recreation Way, the city has a huge pile of mulch that comes from a lot of the tree trimming they do. That's actually a good product. It's very good for most plants, but the more xeric your plants go, so the less water they need and the smaller they get. So if you're dealing with small, low-growing perennials that are native, you're going to want to tend toward more of a rock or a gravel mulch. I will say that rocks are very good at germinating weeds, So if you tend toward a rock mulch or a gravel mulch, you want to make sure that you're planting those areas in such a way that you're going to cover as much of that as humanly possible. So the more open rock and gravel areas you have, the more weeds you're going to have. You know, they're great for lots of low water plants as long as you're planning to plant those in such areas in such a way that the gravel or the rock will be covered almost completely. That will reduce your maintenance. If you go with a wood-based mulch, it will certainly help with weeds, but it might limit your plant selections to shrubs, trees, larger ornamental grasses, and things like that. So it will affect your plant selection a little bit, what mulch you choose. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the next few slides as well.
Okay, Scott, I can reserve some of these to the end. There's quite a few questions still, but some of the themes are, how do I start over with a really weedy area and grass that I need to remove, or rock mulch and a barrier, and then
Right.
tips and tricks about where you start, how do you get things moving, how do you get rid of really tough plants like English ivy.
Right. Okay. So I'll try to address some of that as I go through those next few slides. Try to remember that those are questions that are out there and address those as we go through those slides, if that works for you. Ready
Okay.
to move on?
Yes.
All right, we'll move on. Okay. So we'll talk about low maintenance plants initially. When people go to buy plants, they typically focus on the flowers. This is, you know, an age-old thing. Those are the most attractive part of a plant. They're what plants are often bred for, having large flowers in large numbers. But if your objective is low maintenance, you don't want to prioritize big showy flowers. You want to prioritize longevity, durability, being water wise, fitting in the landscape appropriately. So, you know, if you want to plant a whole bunch of shrubs that are going to cover the ground and compete with the weeds, you want to prioritize that form, you know, that kind of vigor that fits the landscape and fits your need. So maybe bring flowers down on the priority list a little bit. You want to consider mature size. A lot of maintenance headaches are created by planting plants in areas where they're going to grow over a sidewalk, or they're going to grow over the driveway, or swallow the front of your house. You see these things around quite a bit. So you want to make sure that you're really considering the mature size of the plants before you put them in, and that you're putting them in a place where you're not going to have to shear them or prune them just to control their size. This is one of probably the biggest maintenance issues that people run into, is just planting things where they're too big. So you want to really think about that. Fast growing species are something that people often prioritize. They want things to grow fast, and I understand that, particularly with trees, since you know, they live a lot longer than we typically do, and we want them to get to a mature size in the near future. Doing that, however, will potentially create some problems. So things that grow fast tend to be softer wooded, they tend to be messier, they break more easily, things like that. So you might want to think about prioritizing things that are slower growing, harder wooded, you know, that are more durable and won't create a mess in your yard. And maybe most importantly, you want to keep things simple. So as you can see in this picture here, I'm going to put up just the names of plants here because I'm not going to get real into the plants themselves. I did send out an email earlier to all the registrants that includes a plant list, and it's got some a decent amount of description about those plants in there. So hopefully that will help you guys kind of decide what really fits for you. So I won't get into a lot of detail on plants here, but I'm going to try to highlight those as I go through these slides. You want to keep your plant palette pretty simple, plant in masses. That definitely reduces the maintenance over time. If you have many varieties of plants throughout your landscape, each of those may need something slightly different in terms of maintenance. It may become more and more problematic. So keeping it very simple like this landscape is will really help you out. As far as trees go, like I said before, you want to look for things that are slower growing. Typically, if maintenance, low maintenance is a priority for you, you want to think about the leaf, needle, and fruit drop. So if you don't want to deal with pine needles, obviously don't buy pine trees. So you want to think that through though. So a lot of people want crab apples. Well, if you have crab apples, you're going to have crab apples falling from the trees in your yard, and that's going to be a maintenance issue at some point. So think those things through. Don't just prioritize having those flowers and then forget that you're going to have fruit dropping in your yard that you're going to have to clean up. So think that through. If you have Siberian elm, willows, cottonwoods, aspens, Russian olive, those kinds of plants in your yard, you may consider getting rid of those. Those are all pretty high maintenance plants. They're messy and create some challenges. If you're looking to buy trees, I would avoid these. The aspens and cottonwoods, certainly Siberian elm and Russian olive you won't find for sale locally, but certainly avoid those other trees because they tend to be either short-lived or messy or both. For shrubs, you really want to look for things that don't require any shearing or pruning at all. That plant list I sent out to you has notes on every single plant that's in there, and if it doesn't require shearing or if you really should avoid shearing it, it mentions that in there. I think that should really help you narrow down potentially the list of plants you can be looking for. Again, plants that typically don't need to be sheared may need to be sheared if they're not planted in the right location. So if they overgrow the sidewalk again, even a plant that you don't need to shear typically may need to be controlled. So think that through. Even plants that typically don't need that kind of maintenance may if they're not planted in the right location. So you want to avoid species that may seed themselves. This is a question you may want to ask if you're buying plants at a garden center. I've made some notes in our plant list too regarding that. There are a few things that may seed themselves a little bit, but I've tried to leave most of those off of the plant list. I've really tried to make the plant list focused on truly low maintenance plants. So it's a fairly short list, and maybe it'll help you find some things that will work for you. Perennials and ornamental grasses. I'm a big fan of ornamental grasses and perennials. For a low maintenance landscape though, this is where you start to get into a little bit more maintenance, particularly with perennials. It's not always the case, but there are a few on the list that I provided that tend to be pretty low maintenance, where you just cut them back in the early spring or late winter, and that's about all you have to do. Ornamental grasses are great actually in that way. You just cut them back in early spring or late winter, and that's about all you have to do with most of them, particularly the ones I put on the list. Every few years you might need to divide these plants. Particularly the ornamental grasses, or if you have irises or things like that, you might have to dig them up and divide them every few years. That's not all bad, because in that process you'll end up with some additional plants, and that may help fill out your landscape a little bit more basically for free, for a little bit of labor. So those are things to consider here. Basically, as your plants get smaller and smaller and less woody, a lot of times they tend to be a little bit more maintenance, but the plants I put on your list, should be those kinds of plants where we're looking for just one touch, where we're cutting them back in the spring, and that is it. So that's what we're shooting for You definitely have to plan for that, though. If you have a lot of perennials and ornamental grasses, you want to plan for that spring cleanup. In my yard, I generate 2 or 3 truckloads of material every spring that I have to take to Rocky Top Resources to compost. So if you don't have a truck, you don't have access to a truck, certainly a consideration in this planning process. So the more plants that you have that are not woody in nature, the more material you're going to generate every spring to get rid of, and that's something to consider. So lawns, Kentucky bluegrass is still the standard lawn, but if you like that general appearance, but you don't want all that water use, you don't want to have to mow every week, those kinds of things, there are certainly some options for native grasses, and we'll get into a little bit more detail with that. But you really want to think it through before you make a choice to move to a native grass. If you have kids or if you have dogs or something, when you have a lot of traffic on your lawn, converting it to a native grass is probably not a good option. But if your lawn is more for curb appeal, it doesn't receive a lot of traffic, and it's maybe in a place where it's sunny and relatively easy to convert, a native grass may be a really good option for you. So we'll talk more specifics on how that process might work when we start talking about some of the projects. But you'll have to do some ongoing weed control no matter what you do. Native grasses, will get weeds in them, and you will have to figure out how to manage those. It's not that bad typically if you get a good establishment with your native grass, but it's a consideration. So I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on this slide because it's a little more wordy, but this is sort of the synopsis of what I think low maintenance is. For trees, typically I would consider low maintenance to be a tree that needs weekly or less watering. So there are a lot of trees that once they're established, they need very little, if any, additional watering, except maybe during a drought. You want to look for those. Minimal pruning. Many trees, like an oak tree, for example, very seldom is going to need any real pruning. Their form and their structure is such that they're not going to have a lot of weak wooded branches. They're not going to have suckers and things like that you have to deal with. You want to make sure that the trees you select are not going to create a lot of weed seeds. There are definitely some weedy trees out there that put out a lot of seeds that are going to come up in your garden. Crab apples and things like that are examples of things that could potentially seed themselves around, depending on the variety. And make sure that whatever trees you put in are going to fit the space as they mature. It's another problem that people run into a lot. I've seen very large spruce trees in very small areas, and I'm sure most of you have seen this as well around town. So think that through. With shrubs, 1 to 2 waterings per week, I would consider low maintenance. There are certainly native shrubs that need far less than that. So, but if you plant shrubs that are going to need water just as much as Kentucky bluegrass, you're really getting into a high water using plant. So try to keep things that are not going to use water more than 1 or 2 times a week. Don't need fertilization more than once a year. Many native shrubs are not going to want that even. So as you get more native, you're using less water, less fertilizer. Pruning once or every 5 years or so with shrubs. There are a few shrubs that some might consider low maintenance, like some of the smaller spireas that typically need to be sheared back every spring. I didn't add those to the plant list because in terms of maintenance, they tend to be closer to a perennial because they do need to be sheared every year. So look for things that need to be pruned maybe every 5 years or less. Again, no weed seeds and that fit the space provided. So look for those things. Again, on the plant list, I provide a lot of notes about those kinds of factors. Perennials and ornamental grasses, 1 to 3 waterings per week. No more than that, certainly. Typically 1 or 2 is really what we want to shoot for. Fertilize once a year, cut back once a year. Produce no weed seeds or very few weed seeds, so you're not getting perennials that are spreading all over your yard and your neighbor's yard. And again, that fit the space provided. So again, the key here is really things that need to be cut back once a year and will look fine the rest of the summer without you having to deal with them. For lawns, what I consider low maintenance is really as we get into a native lawn like a buffalo grass. Water once a week, fertilize twice a year, mow it once a month, and it's not invasive into other beds. So we'll talk about that next. So low maintenance project. So one option that you have is to plant masses of ornamental grasses. So the grass you see in this photo is ruby muley. So this is a common ornamental grass. We've got a lot of them here at the Xeriscape demonstration garden now. You can use drip irrigation for these, so you can create a grid of drip irrigation. Typically, these, some options for different species are this ruby muley, switchgrass, blonde ambition, blue grama grass. Carl Forester is one that needs a little bit of additional water, but is an option here that you've probably seen around town a lot. So 1 or 2 waterings a week, even less for some of the more native grasses if you chose those for mass plantings to cover the ground. Again, these are going to need to be cut back in the spring, and that is a lot of vegetation to haul out of the yard, so you have to know that you can handle that. And for some of these areas, broadleaf weed control, because you've just planted grasses en masse, if there's something comes up that's not a grass, then it's probably a weed. That kind of helps you narrow the choices, so you don't have to question whether it's a weed or not. And in some cases, there are some broadleaf weed controls out there that are on the market that are considered organic, that could potentially be used for these if you didn't want to pull the weeds. As I mentioned, drip irrigation. So this is called Netafim Tech Line, the brown pipe here. The drip emitters are actually inside the pipe. So typically every 12, 18, or 24 inches, you'll have an emitter. So the spacing will depend on the density of your plantings and the type of vegetation you're planting. If you were to use this as your way of irrigating, this will certainly reduce the amount of weeds you get compared to spray irrigation. It's a very good option for tall plants as well. So for shrubs, tall ornamental grasses, this is a really good way to water things efficiently and without blocking those heads as the plants get taller. You will have to water differently with drip irrigation. So if you choose that, you want to make sure you're watering properly for those plants. This is switchgrass. This is down at the Colorado College. A really nice mass planting of switchgrass. There may be situations in a home landscape where this kind of option is available. As you get taller, it may get a little out of scale with the home, so you need to maybe have a little more space for something like this with a taller grass. But this is a really good option. Very low maintenance once it's established. You can use either a rock mulch or an organic mulch with this kind of plant material. Again, as I mentioned, as the plants get smaller and lower to the ground and require less water, the more likely it is you're going to want to switch over to a rock mulch or a gravel mulch. Otherwise, those plants will be likely to rot. So a buffalo grass lawn is actually a really great option for Colorado Springs. This is actually my front yard, and this is called Sun Dancer buffalo grass. This is on your plant list. This is the best buffalo grass to use for a lawn purpose. It is very low maintenance, as I mentioned. I water it about once a week. I mow it about once a month. You could even get away with less than that if you really wanted to push it. But I tend to like to mow it about once a month. I fertilize it twice a year, once in June and then once in August or September. And so it works out extremely well. My kids do play on it, so it does tolerate some traffic, but you don't want it to be too heavy. So it is a really good low maintenance option as an alternative for lawn. To prepare the soil for that, this area was all excavated, regraded. You definitely want to prepare the soil more or less as if you're putting in a typical Kentucky bluegrass lawn. You want to till it. In my case, because there was a Kentucky bluegrass lawn here before, there was a decent amount of organic matter in the soil. You don't need a lot at all with buffalo grass. It can probably grow in straight clay without too many problems. But the soil is in fine shape. It's got a decent amount of clay in it, but not real heavy. I tilled it to about 6 inches deep, and then seeded it. And then I got a really strong helper to rake it in for me. We rake it into about 1/4 of an inch deep. In my case, because the area is only about 500 square feet, I actually used an erosion blanket to help keep all the soil and all the seeds in place. If you do something like this, if you try to establish any seed at this point, because of the new water-wise rules in effect, you will need to get an establishment permit, because these will need to be watered twice a day through establishment, and then you'll cut back over time. But it may take a full month to 5 weeks or so of watering nearly every day to get it well established. So that's a really important consideration, that it will take an establishment period, and with water-wise rules, you will need a permit. As I mentioned, I did use an erosion blanket for this. This shredded aspen erosion blanket, so there weren't any weed seeds or anything in it. I left this down for about 2 months. It does cool the soil a little, and buffalo grass needs warm soil in order to germinate and stay green. So if you're doing buffalo grass, or as we'll look at here in a little bit, blue grama grass, those are warm season grasses. If you're going to seed those in, you have to seed those in the summer. Really from about mid-May to mid-July is your window. So it's not a big window to do this project to be successful. But if you seed it in the fall, you're going to have a hard time with that, and you'll lose a lot of seed. So it's really best to really shoot for that 2-month window in the summer to establish buffalo grass or blue grama grass. But this is what it looks like. This is unmowed. If you have sandy soil, if you're going to have really heavy traffic, or if you have very deep shade, this is not a great option for you. But it could be a good option for a lot of folks. I think traditionally people thought they had to plant plugs for this to work, but I found that seed works extremely well. So spreading shrubs, as I mentioned before, is a great option. If you want probably the lowest maintenance you can have, you want to look toward spreading shrubs and some sort of wood-based mulch as your primary cover for the landscape. So there are shrubs like these. These are Grillo sumacs. These will cover quite a bit of ground, so you won't have to invest too much money. As long as you have some patience, these things will spread and cover a very large portion of ground over time, and they're relatively short, so they typically do fit into a residential setting pretty well. As you get taller, you know, scale becomes a factor that you want to really consider, but these grow-low sumacs are a good option for, you know, spreading shrubs that will cover the ground. These two could be watered with drip irrigation. This is that Netafim again, a really excellent option to put in just a grid of this as your form of irrigation. Plant the shrubs, mulch them really well with an organic mulch. Make sure you plan to have those grow together over time to create a complete cover, and you can have a really, really low maintenance landscape with something like that. Soil amendments may or may not be necessary with this. Depends again on your soil and on the plant. So the more native they are, like that grow-low sumac, it doesn't really need soil amendments. They could help a little bit initially. What will help is tilling that soil. So by breaking the soil up and loosening it, the roots will have an easier time spreading through those areas and getting well established. So even if you don't amend, sometimes tilling is really valuable. If you can't do that, it will work without tillage. Spreading shrubs is another option. Junipers are a really typical choice for this kind of thing. You can use lavender or other perennials or small shrubs that might bloom to get some more color, but junipers are an excellent option as long as they're properly located. You've probably seen just walking down the sidewalk, any sidewalk in town practically, you can see junipers growing over sidewalks. So be very careful of that. Be very aware of, you know, the size of these plants. Typically stick with something that's less than about 2 foot tall. If you get more than that, then it starts to get out of scale and become problematic over time. So really be aware of size and scale, but this is an excellent option. They compete with weeds extremely well. Native grasses. This is, you know, one of my favorite options because we actually do live in a shortgrass prairie. Buffalo grass, as I mentioned before. This is primarily blue grama grass here in this photo. An excellent option. Again, you typically don't need soil amendments. Blue grama grass actually likes sandy soil. So if you have sandy soil and buffalo grass won't work for you, then blue grama may work. You need to get it established again. If you seed it heavily, water it to get established with an establishment permit. And then you can cut back to once a week, even clear back to once a month with some of these areas for watering. And some of these areas, if you're in the right part of town, adjoining a natural area or something like that, you may only have to mow them once a year, if at all. So really good low maintenance option. There's another view. You will probably have to put in taller sprinkler heads in these areas. These cannot be drip irrigated. They need to be spray irrigated. Even though they're native grasses, they should be irrigated, and I would highly recommend having permanent irrigation installed in these areas to really be successful. So you can type in any more questions you have if you haven't been doing so already. We just have a couple more slides here. There is the option of using ground covers as more or less a lawn alternative. I created a list just specifically for this purpose within your plant list. It's down at the bottom with a list of plants that would be good for this sort of solution. If you're doing this, you probably will want to amend soil with compost. You want it to be enriched a little bit with any of the plants that I've put on the plant list. 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. Sorry, I didn't get the per 1,000 square feet in here, but it's 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. Plant in big drifts, so and plant in densely enough that these things will grow together relatively quickly. That'll definitely reduce your maintenance. This isn't the lowest maintenance option out there, but it can be quite low maintenance once it's established. You will have to do some weed control, but sometimes these plants are not as competitive with weeds as, say, shrubs or even native grasses might be. And probably the simplest solution of all here is just to use a wood-based organic mulch at 3 or 4 inches deep over a lot of the landscape. So in this situation, you know, there are shrubs planted here. I think these are drip irrigated, but much of this area is just mulched and it will never have plants, and it's still functional, useful space, but really easy to maintain, low cost. They're using the mulch that's free from the city to replenish that. It does have to be replenished every couple of years, so you have to plan for that. But you should consider this option if cost is a big concern. This is the simplest, cheapest, probably lowest maintenance option, unless you're in a really windy spot where the mulch is just going to blow away. So certainly worth considering. As I mentioned before, waterwiseplants.org is a great website by Colorado Springs Utilities. So these are local, locally available, locally adaptable plants that we've grown here at the Xeriscape Demonstration Garden for years. In most cases, you can filter by what you want. So shrubs, flowers, grasses, how much water use, how much maintenance, light requirements, all those kinds of things you can filter for. And then again, you can create a favorites list that you can go to and potentially print out or save. It'll say you can save a bookmark, so you can go back to that website repeatedly if you want. So it's a really, really good resource for the best plants here. Just to give a little plug for some future things we have coming up. We have a couple of virtual tours of the demonstration garden, and in July we have a smart watering practices class, which is really an irrigation class. And so please feel free to attend those and get more information. So I'm ready for more questions.
Okay, Scott, here's just a few quick questions. Where do you get the mulch from the city?
So that's typically there is a site on Recreation Way, which is right next to I-25, just south of Fontanero, on the east side of I-25. Colorado Springs Utilities typically has a pile at Leon Young Service Center, which is on South Hancock Expressway, which I haven't checked to see if they have that pile this year, but that's usually there. But the Recreation Way site always has that pile there.
Okay. A couple of these are about the your home. Can you have the sumac you talked about close to the house foundation?
I wouldn't put it real close to the house foundation. It's not going to cause a problem for the foundation like a tree would. It's not that aggressive, but it's a decent sized plant, so you want to give it space to really grow. So if you plant it real close, it may become problematic because it's just a good sized plant. There are probably better choices for something close to the house that are smaller, something, maybe in the 3 to 4 foot wide size range, and there are some on the plant list that would fit that criteria.
Okay, and what's the brand name of the irrigation line you were referring to?
It's called Netafim, Netafim.
Okay, and what do you mean by moderate traffic versus high traffic?
That's a good question. So my kids, I consider them moderate traffic. So they're not playing sports on it. They're kind of running back and forth on it. It's not every day. It's probably 3 days a week that they're running back and forth on the lawn. If you've got kids that are gonna, really play sports on it, kick a soccer ball back and forth, run hard on it nearly every day in the summer, that's heavy traffic in my opinion. So a native grass would not be a good choice for that sort of situation. But running across it a little bit here and there, 3 days a week, yeah, native grass can probably handle that just fine.
Okay, and what's the ground cover near the flagstone near the sidewalk? It was in the flowering in the aspen blanket picture.
So there was an ice plant, I believe, in that picture. I'd have to go back. Maybe I can get back there. Yeah, that's an ice plant. That's called fire spinner ice plant.
Okay, and is there an efficient way to keep mulch free of leaf debris?
It's a little bit challenging. Gravel mulch is a little bit easier to deal with in that regard because you can rake it clean more easily, especially if it's a smaller aggregate rock like a pea gravel or something that's less than an inch in diameter. It can be quite easy to deal with. If it's a wood mulch, it does get a little bit more challenging, but I've just found that a light raking works pretty well. That way you don't move too much of the wood mulch, but you're getting the leaves or pine needles or other debris that blows in. So I think really a rake is the best solution. If the mulch is really well settled, if it's the kind of wood mulch that will settle, and form a bit of a mat, a blower can work pretty well also, but you need to be somewhat careful with that. Maybe keep it on a lower setting as you're blowing things out.
Okay, and what do you recommend for the area in between paver stones?
So one of my favorite ground covers is called Turkish Veronica or Turkish Speedwell. It's low growing, dense, vigorous. It likes that space between pavers pretty well. We actually have an area here at the Xeriscape demonstration garden that has flagstone pavers with Turkish Veronica growing between the pavers. That's my favorite one. There are varieties of thyme that will work. I would stay away from the miniature thyme, the really small one. It actually tends to die back in the winter, but that's a choice that a lot of people make because they've, it tends to be in a lot of catalogs and things like that. That if you see things planted between pavers, very often it's this very small thyme, but it doesn't work that well in our climate. There are a couple of other varieties of Veronica. So Veronica is an excellent one, ground cover Veronicas. Choose a more vigorous form of low growing thyme if you went with a thyme. Those are good choices. The plant list has that group at the bottom of the plant list that is, sort of the ground cover lawn alternative. There are 2 or 3 on that list that could work.
Okay, and what's a good ground cover in a shady area under a tree?
One of the best things is vinca that I found here for shady areas. Periwinkle is a common name for it. So vinca minor is the scientific name. You may see it listed as that. It's semi-evergreen to evergreen. It's blooming right now. Very attractive. It's surprisingly resilient. It doesn't look like the kind of plant that would be resilient in a kind of semi-arid climate, but it's a very tough plant. You do need to water it some. Certainly to get it established, you need to water it. And it will, it may struggle to compete sometimes with tree roots if it's a silver maple or something like that. Many things struggle to compete with a silver maple, but it's a really good option. There's another plant called sweet woodruff, which is needs a little more water, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but it tends to do well in the shade. The other thing that does well that's not necessarily a ground cover, but planted in mass would have the same effect are hardy geraniums. So there are definitely some good hardy geraniums that could be used in that setting as well. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and come visit the Xeriscape garden.